The sandals left at the door in a quiet village between Emos and the sea, there lived a woman named Maria. She ran a guest house that had long outlived its need empty more often than full, echoing with the memory of voices now faded. But still, every evening, she swept the floor, laid out olive bread and oil, lit a lamp, and left the door open, not out of habit, but because of him. Years ago, on a dusty morning after the Passover, 2 men had arrived at her door, strangers, tired, speaking softly about a man they had walked with, someone who had opened the scriptures to them, as if he'd written them himself. "We didn't know it was him until he broke the bread," one said, eyes wide with reverent disbelief. "He vanished after," the other added, "but something burned in our hearts while he walked beside us." They stayed just one night, but before leaving, they asked if she had ever heard of Jesus of Nazareth. She had, but she had never met him, not then. After they left, she kept the door open, just in case. One evening, as shadows stretched across her courtyard, a man appeared, sandals worn, robe stained with travel, and kindness in his gaze. He said only, "Peace be upon this house." She felt her knees go weak, not because she recognized his face, but because her soul did. She invited him in. He sat, ate, blessed the bread without ceremony. His words were few, but his silence spoke louder than any priest's scroll. There was no lightning, no miracles, just presence pure and piercing. When she awoke the next morning, he was gone, but beside the door were his sandals, not forgotten, not lost, left, as if to say, "I was here, and I will be again." She wept holding them, not because they were sacred, but because she finally understood. He had come for her, too, not as a healer, not as a spectacle, but as a guest, humble and holy. She never wore the sandals, but she never hid them either. Every guest who entered her home walked by them, and many, without knowing why, spoke gentler, lingered longer, listened deeper. And sometimes one would pause, hand on the doorway, eyes wide, and whisper, "Why do I feel like I've been here before?" And she would simply smile and say, "Because the one who walked the road still walks it, and this house remembers." From this story we understand Jesus does not only come in blinding miracles or loud proclamations. Sometimes he enters as a traveler, a stranger, a presence that feels familiar before we know his name. And when he visits even just once, he leaves behind something no broom can sweep away: the holy echo of belonging. The boat that stayed on shore there was a boat that never returned to water. It rested on the edge of the Sea of Galilee, turned slightly toward the east, its hull weathered by sun more than by storm. Children played beside it. Fishermen leaned on it when nets were too heavy to lift. No one tried to repair it. No one dared, because that boat once belonged to Jonah, son of Ezrath, the man who stopped fishing the day Jesus stepped in. Jonah had been a fisherman like his father and his father before him. He knew the tides by scent, the weight of fish by feel, and the worth of silence between waves. He was not rich, but his hands were strong, and his pride lived in how little he needed. Until one dawn, after a night of failure, his nets came up empty, and a man stepped onto his boat, uninvited, unbothered, and asked him to row. Jonah nearly refused, but something in the stranger's voice, calm, commanding, compassionate, moved him more than any storm ever had. So he pushed out. The man taught, not to impress, but to awaken. And then he turned to Jonah and said, "Cast your nets." Again, Jonah laughed, bitter. There's nothing out there. But he obeyed. The net sank, then strained, then overflowed. Fish so many that the boat nearly tipped. And Jonah, for the first time in his life, was afraid. Not of the deep, but of the depth within the man before him. He fell to his knees. "Depart from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." But the man only smiled. "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will catch men." Jonah left the boat on the shore that day. He followed, he saw miracles, heard parables, watched lepers cleansed and the proud undone. He walked behind the Son of God through villages, storms, betrayal, and resurrection. And when it was over, the sky had turned black and then dawned again, he returned to the shoreline, not to reclaim the boat, but to remember where he left his old life behind. He never sailed again. Others offered to fix it. He refused. "Let it sit," he said. "Let it tell its story without words." Fishermen who knew him brought their sons to see it. "This is where Jonah met the Christ," they'd say, "where the sea gave way to something greater." And sometimes, late in the evening, Jonah would sit beside it, alone, watching the sun dip into waters that once ruled his life, and whisper, "You gave me everything, the moment I gave you my nothing." From this story, we understand, when Jesus steps into our empty spaces, he does not ask for perfection, he asks for trust. And when we leave behind what once defined us, even the forgotten boats of our past become monuments of grace, because where we met him becomes holy ground forever. Asterisk, the room at the edge of the roof in the old quarter of Bethany, above a house. Built from sun-dried stone, there was a small room at the topper chamber, open to the sky, framed by vines and silence. It was nothing special. A cot, a jug of water, and a woven mat. But everyone in town knew that room had once held the Savior. It belonged to a man named Adin, a scroll copyist by trade. Quiet, precise, not devout like the priests, nor loud like the prophets. He kept to himself, but he loved one thing deeply: hospitality. Whenever travelers passed through, Adin offered the upper room. It was all he had. He never charged, never asked names, only smiled and said, "Rest here. The wind is soft." He had hosted many strangers, but one evening a man arrived unlike any other. He wore no insignia, carried no scroll. But the moment he entered the gate, Adin felt something shift in the air as if the roof above him bowed slightly in reverence. The man looked up at the room. "May I stay here tonight?" he asked. Adin nodded, unsure why his hands were trembling. That evening he brought bread, olives, and cool water. The man thanked him, touched the bread gently, and began to eat slow, present, as if each bite meant something eternal. Adin sat across the room, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. The man broke the quiet. "You copy the words of prophets," he said, "but have they reached your heart yet?" Adin swallowed. "Sometimes they echo, but mostly they stay ink on parchment." The man stood and walked to the open wall. He looked over the hills, where the city flickered with torchlight. "One day, soon," he said, "those words will walk, bleed, rise." And then he turned, placed his hand on Adin's shoulder, and said, "Keep this room ready. It will be used." Again, by morning, he was gone. But Adin could not sleep, nor forget. Days later, he heard of a man crucified outside the city. They said he was the one who healed lepers, who raised the dead, who claimed he would rebuild the temple in 3 days. and something in Din's soul broke open like torn parchment. He ran home, cleaned the room, lit a lamp, and waited. Years passed, many. Stayed in that room disciples in hiding, widows in mourning, young men seeking meaning. Ardin said little. He just brought bread and water, the same way he had that night, and once, on the evening of Pentecost. He swore he saw light pour through the roof, not from the stars, but from somewhere deeper, a flame that didn't burn, a warmth that didn't end. He never explained it, only told one friend before his death, the prophets were right. The word came, he rested here. From this story we understand, when we open even the smallest space to Christ, he fills it with eternity. What seems like a simple room becomes a sanctuary, and what seems like ordinary bread becomes part of the story of God made flesh. Hospitality, when offered without pride, becomes the stage where heaven touches earth. The chair he never sat in the town of Nain, where the streets wound like tired ribbons through clay homes and courtyards filled with fig trees. There was a carpenter named Abban. He lived alone, though the table in his house was built for 6. Chair had a name carved underneath his wife, Miriam, their sons, Elia, Asa, and little Yonam, and one blank. A 6th chair, slightly different from the others. No one knew who it was for. No one ever asked, but the town remembered the day Abban buried them all. A fever came one winter, took them one by one. By spring, the laughter had gone from his house. He stopped carving, stopped smiling, stopped speaking, except in trades and short nods. Yet every week he still swept the house, set the table, polished the wood of the empty chairs, and the 6th chair. He made it during the days of mourning, simple, smooth, unmarked. When asked, he'd only say, "It's for when he comes." They thought he meant a guest, or perhaps a priest, but the way he spoke it, with a trembling softness, made some wonder if he meant something more years past. Abban aged, his hair turned like dust, his hands stiffened. He no longer built for others, only maintained the home that once held joy. One day the town filled with a funeral procession. A widow's only son had died, and his body was being carried outside the gate. The crowd moved, slow, grief pressing on every shoulder. Abban watched from his doorway. Something about the mother's eyes, the way she held her sorrow with silence, unlocked a long-frozen ache in him. And then, through the crowd, came a man. He wasn't dressed as a priest. He didn't carry scrolls. But when he touched the stretcher, everything changed. The boy breathed. The mother collapsed into sobs, and the town stood still. Later that evening, as the sun dipped into the hills and light poured across the floor like gold, footsteps approached Abban's door. There stood the same man, dust on his sandals, peace in his eyes. Abban didn't speak. He just stepped aside and gestured toward the 6th chair. The man smiled, entered, and sat. They didn't say much, just broke bread, sipped water, shared the quiet like old friends reunited. When the man stood to leave, Abban finally asked, voice fragile, why her son and not mine? The man looked into his eyes and answered, because you have been keeping this chair warm for a very long time, and I do not let that go unnoticed. He placed his hand on Abban's shoulder, just long enough for the years of sorrow to melt into something softer. Then he left. Abban never removed that chair, never added a name, but every evening after that, he sat beside it, not in it, and smiled. From this story, we understand, Hope is not always loud. Sometimes it is a chair we keep ready for someone who hasn't come. But when the Lord enters the home of our long-kept grief, he does not explain it away, he honors it. And in doing so, turns our waiting into something holy. Asterisk the blanket folded on the wall in a quiet corner of Capernaum, where fishermen mended nets by the lake shore and children chased goats through narrow alleys, there was a woman named Elisheba, who was known not for what she did, but for what she kept. She lived in a modest home with whitewashed walls, cracked in places where the sun pressed too long. The house was simple, no husband, no children, just a fig tree that leaned into her window and the sound of water jars clinking in the mornings. But what made Elisheba different was a blanket. It was folded perfectly on a wooden peg above her. Bed never used, never touched, and always dusted before sundown. It was deep crimson, embroidered at the edges with golden thread, clearly once meant for celebration. And though time had faded its brightness, it still carried a quiet dignity, like a garment that remembered being touched by joy. People assumed it was a wedding gift, never fulfilled. Others whispered it belonged to a child she had lost. But Elisheba never explained. She only glanced at it sometimes, eyes distant, as if listening for something long delayed. One evening, she saw a crowd moving through the street, not shouting, singing. They said the teacher had arrived, the one who healed without herbs, who taught with parables instead of law, who knew your thoughts before you spoke. Elisheba didn't join the crowd. She stood behind her door, heart hesitant. She had once been hopeful, once believed in promises, but years of loss had made her cautious. Faith, when it is stretched too long without fulfillment, begins to ache like an old wound in the cold. Later that night, after the crowd had scattered and silence returned to the streets, someone knocked on her door. She opened it to find a young girl barefoot, eyes wide. "My mother said you have a blanket," the girl whispered. "My brother's cold. We have no fire." Elisheba said nothing. She looked at the peg dot at the blanket, at the years she had guarded it, waited for a reason, grand enough to unfold it then, without a word. She took it down, wrapped it around the girl, and said quietly, "Tell your brother. It was always meant for someone like him." The next morning, she stood by the window, expecting the old ache to return. But it didn't. Instead, there was warmth not from the sun, but from the space left by the giving. A few days later, she heard a voice in the street, calm, confident, filled with grace. "He who keeps his life will lose it, but he who loses it for my sake will find it." She stepped outside and followed. From this story, we remember, what we protect may one day protect someone else. And sometimes the thing we think is meant for our joy becomes a vessel for another's healing. God does not waste what we keep in love, but he often invites us to release it, so that it may finally become what it was created to be. Asterisk, the cup he carried twice was a small cup, earthen, uneven at the lip, stained dark at the bottom from years of wine and sorrow. Levi, the innkeeper, kept it tucked behind the counter of his roadside inn just outside Bethany. Place travelers forgot the moment they left. Levi did not forget, not the cup, not the night it was used. He had once been full of song, his laughter warm, his food generous, his welcome loud. But time and bitterness brewed together like old vinegar. His wife had passed. His sons left for Rome. His guests came, with full mouths and empty hearts, and Levi had stopped smiling. Then came the Passover, years ago now. His inn was full, overflowing. Strangers poured in by the hour. Soldiers, merchants, pilgrims, and among them 12 dusty men and their rabbi. Quiet, calm, with eyes that unsettled the soul and gentled it at once. The teacher spoke little, but when he did, even the fireplace crackling seemed to hush. That evening they sat together in Levi's upper room. He watched from behind a curtain, first just curious, then transfixed. The teacher took bread, broke it, gave thanks. Then he took that old earthen cup, the one Levi had forgotten was even there, and lifted it. "This cup," he said, "is the new covenant in my blood, poured out for many." Levi couldn't move. The words settled into him like seed into soil. He didn't understand, but he knew something had just been changed forever. The next morning, they were gone. By noon, the streets screamed with the sound of accusation. "Crucify him," they cried. And Levi's sit was him, the man who had held his cup, the man who had blessed it, the man who had given thanks for suffering. He followed the crowd to the hill, watched from a distance, and when the sky darkened and the curtain tore, and the world held its breath in the stillness of death, Levi wept, not because he understood, but because something inside him had broken open. Like that bread the night before, he returned home, found the cup, washed it gently, and placed it on a shelf above his heart. Years passed. He told no one, until one evening a traveler came, young, wide-eyed, carrying only a satchel and questions. He asked Levi for wine. Levi poured it into that same cup. The boy sipped, paused, and whispered, "I've heard of him." The teacher, was he here? Levi looked down at his hands, still stained, still shaking, and for the first time in decades, he answered with clarity, "He still is." From this story we reflect. The things Christ touches do not remain ordinary. A loaf, a cup, a man, each becomes sacred, not because of their worth, but because of his presence. And when he drinks from your life, even once, you will never be empty again. The door without a lock near the northern gate of Jericho stood a small, uneven house with a door that never closed. It leaned off its hinges, always slightly ajar, even when winds turned the dust into whirlwinds. Most thought it was the home of a beggar, a forgetful old man, or someone too poor to afford a latch. But the truth was quieter than that. It belonged to a man named Malak, and he left his door open on purpose. Years ago, Malak had been a jailer, stern, square, a man who spoke little and trusted less. He kept order with a ring of keys and a belt of rules. When the governor slept, Malak walked the halls. When prisoners wept, he closed his ears. One afternoon, a strange man was brought into his charge, accused of stirring trouble, of calling fishermen to follow him. Instead, Malak did not understand him, but there was something unsettling in his silence, in the way he looked at people, even at the guards, like he knew them. That night, Malak offered him water, not out of kindness, but out of curiosity. Yeshua took the cup, drank, and whispered, "There will be a night when you thirst for mercy, more than water. When it comes, open your door." Then they took him away. Malak never saw him again, but he heard. Everyone did. Of the hill, the nails, the tomb, and the morning that changed everything. Malak left his post the next day, sold his keys, melted the brass into a lamp. He bought a small home with the little coin he had, and he removed the lock from the door. He kept it open day and night, not out of fear, but hope. Hope that one day someone lost, someone aching, someone desperate for mercy might find their way to him. And no, they didn't have to knock. He fed the hungry, sat with the angry, gave his bed to the weary, and took the floor. People called him foolish, said thieves would come. Some did, but more often it was the ones who came barefoot, tear-streaked, trembling, carrying regrets instead of weapons. And they left lighter, sometimes healed, sometimes just heard, but always received. And when asked why, he would answer simply, because someone left heaven's door open for me once. Now I'm only doing the same. From this story, we understand. Grace is not locked behind ceremony or worthiness. It swings open at the quietest turning of a heart. And when we have tasted such mercy, the only thing left to do is remove the latch from our own lives and become a door for others to walk through. Asterisk. The robe in the market in the crowded heart of the Jerusalem marketplace, where voices rose like birds startled from trees, there was a stall that sold second-hand garments, tunics faded by sun, sandals worn thin, cloaks that once carried perfume or sweat, now folded and stacked like forgotten stories. The woman who ran the stall was named Adira. She was quick with numbers, sharp with customers, and known for never accepting less than the worth of a thread. To her, cloth was history, and price was truth. But there was one item she refused to sell. A robe, simple, coarse, torn near the hem. It hung in the back, half-shaded. As though waiting, she had found it years ago, abandoned in an alley outside the city gates, after a Roman execution, just left there, tangled in the dust, as if it didn't matter. She was about to toss it when she noticed the stitching not perfect, but patient, like someone had sewn it not with speed, but with care. And inside the collar, barely visible, a single olive blossom stitched in grey thread. She washed it, kept it, but never wore it. And then, one spring morning, a man came to her stall not to buy, but to listen. He stood silently for a while, watching the people pass. His face was plain, his sandals cracked, but his eyes had something that unsettled her, not because they were intense, but because they were kind. He finally asked, "Why don't you sell the robe?" She hesitated, then replied, "Because it belongs to someone who gave it away without asking anything in return." The man nodded, as if he understood something deeper than she had meant. "Do you know," he said softly, "that he wore it before they tore his own?" Adira froze. She looked at the robe again. Suddenly it felt heavier, as though it carried more than fabric. She asked, "Was it really his?" The man didn't answer directly. He only reached out and gently touched the edge of the robe, then said he never needed to keep anything. He only gave. Even the robe he wore, he gave that too. Then he turned and walked into the crowd. She never saw him again. But that evening, she took the robe down, folded it carefully, and placed it in a wooden box lined with linen. Not to hide it, but to honor it. She never told anyone the full story. But from that day, if a poor man came by without a tunic, she gave him one. If a child came barefoot, she gave them sandals. And when asked why, she would point toward the empty hook where the robe once hung and say, "Because some gifts, once received, change how you value everything." From this story, we reflect. The things of God are often hidden in what the world discards. A torn robe, a quiet act, a man no one noticed. But grace, once received, transforms how we see every garment, every coin, every face. When we truly grasp the weight of what was given to us, generosity is no longer a choice, it becomes a calling. Asterisk. The lamp that was never lit at the edge of Cana. Nestled behind a vineyard where the leaves grew thick and lazy under the sun, there stood a home built from uneven stone and stitched with vines. Inside, tucked away on the highest shelf, sat a lamp unlit, unused, yet never dusty. It belonged to a man named Simeon. Simeon was not a priest, not a prophet. He was a potter. His hands were always marked by earthworms, shaped by years, of molding clay into vessels, cups, and bowls for other people's tables. His work was humble, his life quiet, but his heart held something that few ever noticed: expectancy. Many years ago, at a wedding not far from his kill, Simeon had witnessed something strange. 6 large water jars filled to the brim, not with water, but wine. He had helped make those jars. He had fired their clay, shaped their lips. He knew every curve of them, and that day what poured from their mouths was not water. It was wonder. He never forgot the taste. People called it a miracle. He called it an envy, so not to light his house, not to brighten his workbench, but to be ready. He remembered hearing from a traveler about 10 virgins who waited in the dark, and prepared, some not. He didn't want to be found among the latter. So he shaped the lamp with his own hands, filled it with oil, and placed it where he could always see it. Each morning he checked the wick. Each evening he checked the oil. But he never lit it, not yet. Neighbors mocked him. Some called him superstitious. Others said he was wasting good oil. But Simeon kept watching the road, especially at dusk, when shadows stretched long and hearts turned inward. One twilight, a child ran up to his doorstep, breathless. "They say he's near," the boy shouted. "The teacher, the one who healed the blind man. He's coming this way." Simeon stood slowly. His hands were clay-stained, but his eyes were clear. He walked to the shelf, took the lamp into his palms, and lit it for the first time. And as the flame danced into life, he whispered not to the child, not to the wind, but to the silence that had waited with him all these years. "Let him find me ready." That evening, when the teacher passed through the town, he did not stop at the governor's house, nor at the synagogue. He paused outside a potter's home, where a single lamp burned like hope refusing to sleep, and smiled. From this story, we remember, faith is not only what we believe, it's how we prepare. The ones who wait in quiet obedience may never make headlines, but their lamps shine brightest when the bridegroom draws near. It is not the flame that earns his presence. It is the heart behind the unlit lamp, waiting in love. The jar left at the well in the dusty outskirts of Sychar. There was a well where people came to draw water, share gossip, and sometimes to forget. But there was one woman who always came when no one else was around, just before noon, when the sun scorched the earth and no shadow dared to linger. Her name was Dahlia. She carried a clay jar on her head and a heavier one in her heart. Dahlia had been married 5 times. The 6th man didn't call her his wife. The women of the town whispered. Behind her back, the men stared too long. So she learned to walk with her eyes on the ground, where shame and silence became her only companions. One noon, as the dust swirled and heat pressed like a hand against her chest, she arrived at the well and found someone already there, a man, sitting alone. She hesitated, but the jar on her head reminded her that thirst was still a louder voice than fear. "Will you give me a drink?" the man asked. She paused. No one ever asked her for anything. Not like that. Not gently. "You were Jew asking me, a Samaritan woman." "If you knew who was asking," he replied, you would have asked him instead, and he would give you living water. She laughed, not out of mockery, but out of defense. What living water? Who offers salvation to women with broken reputations and dry tongues? But he kept speaking, not about her body, but her soul. Not about what she had done, but what she could become. You've had 5 husbands, he said, and the man you are with now is not your husband, but I do not condemn you. Her heart skipped because he did not flinch. He did not avert his gaze. He did not speak her name like a curse. He simply saw her, and in that moment, she became someone else. She left her jar at the well, ran into the town where everyone hated her, and cried out not with shame, but with awe. Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did, yet still spoke to me like I was worthy of love. That evening, many came to the well, not because they were thirsty for water, but because they had seen what happens when one woman is finally seen by a man who sees with the eyes of God. The jar stayed by the well for many days, a reminder that when the soul is filled, even the thirst of the body becomes secondary. From this story, we are reminded God does not draw near to those who are already pure in the eyes of others, but to those who are parched with longing to be known and loved, even in their ruins. Sometimes the most sacred transformation begins not with a miracle, but with a conversation that heals a wound we've forgotten we were still carrying. The coins she never spent there was an alley in Jerusalem, known only by those who walked with their heads down. It ran behind the temple's outer courts, where shadows stretched long and the scent of myrrh mixed with the dust. At the end of that alley lived a woman named Tamar. She was a widow, not the noble kind sung of in Proverbs. She was the sort of widow who counted every coin 3 times before buying bread, the kind others passed without greeting. She had no sons, no protector, and no name left in her father's house. Each day she walked the same path, wrapped in the same faded shawl, clutching the same small pouch tied to her waist. In that pouch were 2 copper coins, her last. They weren't much, together barely worth a single meal, but they were hers, and as long as she had them, she had some small sense of control, a thread of dignity left to hold. She had heard rumors of a teacher who spoke of the kingdom as if it were near, who said the meek would inherit the earth, the mourning would be comforted, and the poor would be blessed. She had laughed when she first heard it. Poor people weren't blessed. They were invisible, but something in her stirred a restlessness, not of hunger, but of hope. One morning, just after the incense smoke began to rise from the temple, Tamar took the coins and walked toward the treasury. She didn't know why. She only knew that keeping them would not save her, but maybe giving them would mean she belonged somewhere, to someone. She approached quietly, her steps swallowed by the murmurs of richer men dropping heavy bags into bronze basins. Their coins clanged with authority. Hers whispered, she dropped them in. They made barely a sound, but heaven heard. From across the court, a teacher watched. His eyes soft, deep, knowing followed her, not with pity, but with reverence. Did you see? He said to those beside him. She gave more than all of them. They gave out of their surplus. She gave all she had. Tamar didn't hear him. She didn't know she had been seen. She only knew that, for the first time in years, her steps felt lighter. She had no money left, but she had something far more valuable now: peace. She walked back through the alley, past the temple gates, into a world still broken but with a soul no longer afraid. From this story, we remember heaven is not moved by the size of what we give, but by the depth of what we surrender. When we place even our smallest offering into the hands of God, it becomes a testimony, not of wealth, but of trust. And trust, given in secret, echoes in eternity. Asterisk the bench by the olive tree on the far edge of Bethany, where the path curved away from the market and toward the Mount of Olives. There was a single wooden bench weather-worn, leaning slightly to the left and shaded by a twisted, ancient tree. Few noticed it, even fewer sat on it. But every morning, just after sunrise, a man named Eli would walk out with a small loaf of bread, a clay cup of water, and a piece of cloth for wiping the dew from the seat. He would sit quietly, break the bread, sip the water, and wait. He did this for years. No one knew why. He had no family left, no children, no livestock, no purpose, some would say. Just a man, alone with a bench and a tree. When asked, he would only smile and say, "I'm keeping a promise." Years earlier, Eli had been a proud man, sharp-tongued, quick-tempered, wealthy from selling oil pressed from the very olives that shaded that same tree. But pride built walls, not homes. And over time, those he loved drifted or ran far from him. His brother Judah, gentler and slower to speak, had tried to reconcile with him once. The conversation ended with broken plates and silence that lasted a lifetime. Judah had gone to hear the teacher, the one who healed the sick and ate with the undeserving. He returned, changed, quieter, kinder, with a fire in his eyes that no longer sought to win arguments, but to love anyway. He asked Eli to join him one morning, to sit beneath the olive tree and listen. Eli refused. That evening, Judah died in the violence of a Roman raid on a nearby village, a victim of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Eli never forgave himself. Weeks later, he returned to the spot Judah had spoken of, sat on the bench Judah had built, and wept. That day, he made a vow not to God, not to men, but to his brother's memory. He would sit there every morning, in silence, bread, water, a space beside him, just in case anyone needed a place to be. Heard, years passed, people came and went. Some sat beside him without words, others poured out their grief. Some found faith, a few found forgiveness. Eli never preached. He just listened. One morning, near the end of his life, a stranger in dusty robes sat beside him. He had kind eyes, worn sandals, and hands that looked like they had both healed and bled. The man took the bread from Eli's hand, broke it, and shared it back. Then he said only this, "Your brother